Okay, we are reaching England and the ascension of England, and not just England, but specifically London, to the hub of Western culture, where it remained for the better part of 200 years, um, longer depending on where you measure by. But for a good 200 years, England and London in particular served as the hub of Western culture, and in many ways ran the world. Not even an exaggeration. London ruled the world in a way that has never been seen before. Um, it controlled roughly a quarter of the landmass of the entire world and probably about a third of the population. Um, we're in this class, we're going to hit the very beginning of this. Okay, we're not going to be talking about the Victorian era, which was really the height of the power of England. Um, but we are going to talk about the Tudors, and we are actually going to talk a little bit about my family because they were a part of this. So in 1547, London uh, had about 80,000 people, really about only 4% of the entire population. Um, but by the time it reached 1700, okay, only 150 years later, 500,000 people, and about 10% of the population of the entire country. Um, Got the dog down here. He's ear scratches sometimes. Um, and this is despite the fact that the plague kept hitting and going through London during this time, killing countless. If the plague hadn't been hitting, who knows how big London would have grown. Um, so we're going to be talking about the Dissolution Act, which gets rid of the Church of England, redistributes its wealth. It mentions it at the beginning. We're not going to get into great detail to it until later. But about 60% of the property in some parts of the city was owned by the church. Okay. And the church, not only did the church control large chunks of the city, it also controlled large chunks of England. Um, and we're going to talk about Henry VIII and how he changed all that. Um, so as people kept moving in, the overpopulation happened, overcrowding, all the problems that you would see with a large city now were occurring in England at the time. Um, we look at the founding of Jamestown in America under English rule, and the founding of what would eventually become the United States. Um, so let's talk about Henry VIII. Henry VIII is often regarded as he's kind of made jokes of all the wives, but Henry was a brilliant political mind. Before he put on all the weight, he was an incredible athlete. Henry would often participate in jousts in disguise, other as well as other types of physical competition. Um, so, and he would do it in disguise so that people wouldn't throw the matches against him. He was a poet. He was talented musically. He was a Renaissance man, and he was a huge man. For the time, he was about, if I remember correctly, he was about 6'2", which again, remember, people used to be a lot shorter. 6'2" is tall now. It was huge then. Henry, of course, did love to eat. And by the time he got older, he had a 54-inch waist. The man could eat people under the table. He also had a voracious sexual appetite. Married, as I mentioned, 6 times, and we're going to go through the wives. We're going to talk about them, as well as countless mistresses. Um, so he, they, I'm actually going to post a link to a song on this. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded survived. The 6 wives of Henry VIII. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess. And of course, at this point, Henry was as were all rulers of Europe, or almost all rulers of Europe, was Catholic. This is at the very start of the Reformation, and so we don't have large swaths of Protestant countries yet. Although, of course, this was fomenting in the German area, in Germany. And Catherine, as the Princess of Spain, Catherine of Aragon, united England and Spain. These were the 2 great powers at the time, okay? And Henry fell in love with Catherine's serving lady, or her maid in waiting, Anne Boleyn. And he wanted to get a divorce. And because Catherine had previously been married to his brother, now deceased, they had to get special dispensation from the Pope for him to marry her. And the Pope wasn't about to undo the special dispensation that he has done to allow this in the first place, so he said no. And Henry's like, you know what? Fine. And realized that up to this point, Henry, devout Catholic, had fought for the church. He had gotten the title Defender of the Faith, which he took very seriously because it elevated him above other rulers, getting this title from the Pope. But he decided, you know what? Fine. I'm going to create my own church, and I'm going to be the head of it. And he did. And so he created the Church of England, which we now call the Anglican Church. And despite the fact that it was separate, very similar, okay? Anglicanism is about as close to Catholicism as you can get. Henry left the church, but he didn't leave the traditions and a lot of its beliefs. Married Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn got around a little bit, okay? And Henry, of course, could not have this woman make him a fool, and so he had her beheaded. After that, he married Catherine, Anne, next wife, not Anne of Cleves, not Catherine Parr, not Catherine Howard. I'm missing a wife. Anne Boleyn and... Anyway, the next wife that he married, he actually loved. And I believe that was Catherine Parr. But she died in childbirth. So he turned around. Next, he marries Anne of Cleves, who was German. And this, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but the picture, Henry had the famous painter Hans Holbein go around and do pictures of some of the various potential suitors or potential wives for him. And Anne basically inspired him to make her look a little bit better than she did. And so he sees this picture and he's like, oh yeah, I can go for that. She shows up, she's kind of horse-faced. And Henry's like, oh my God. And so he divorces her. And then finally, next he marries Catherine Howard. Now, Catherine Howard, relative of mine, distant, obviously. There were two... Jane Seymour was the one who died. Jane Seymour is the wife who died in childbirth. And she died giving birth to a daughter, Mary. and we're going to talk a little bit about Mary later. So the Seymours and the Howards at this point were probably the two most prestigious families outside of the king themselves, the king's family, the Tudors. And so Catherine is 19. She's already been fairly sexually active. She was groomed by older men. Of course, she always thought she was in love with them. And Catherine, at 19, married this man that was, at this point, rapidly becoming fat and overweight and much older than her. And she did it, of course, to, seal the bond between the two families. It was a political alliance. But she started sleeping around with somebody else, and she promptly ended up getting beheaded as well. Her brother, Henry Howard, who was the Earl of Surrey, was a noted poet. He actually invented the Shakespearean sonnet, which Shakespeare later immortalized. Henry got beheaded before he could do much with it, but Henry is a well-known poet in his own right. The Seymours, Jane Seymour's family, accused him of being a Catholic and supporting Catholicism, which of course would be a direct rebellion against the Anglican Church and thus Henry himself. And so Henry had him locked up in the Tower of London and beheaded as well. Finally, Catherine Parr, who stayed with Henry till the end of his life. Catherine took care of Henry as his health declined, and outlived him, but only by a year, ironically enough. So those are your wives. Okay, Catherine of Aragon of Spain. Now, why am I doing this? So Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. So normally I can just run those off like that. I'm having a day. All right. So even though Henry was very concerned with spiritual matters, in that, or at least with the church, Henry was also very much a humanist. Okay, in other words, he was interested in what happened in the physical world that mattered to him a lot. And as such, he surrounded himself with scholars. He actually, in a lot of ways, invited criticism, but there were certain places where people could criticize and certain places where it crossed a line in his mind. So in Erasmus, Henry was very close with Erasmus, who we talked about last chapter. Erasmus wrote the Adages, which was a critique of Henry and an obvious one. Thomas More, near and dear to my heart. Thomas More wrote Utopia, which is the combination of the Greek words for not and topia, or topos meaning place, although the you in Utopia can also mean good. So it's a good place and no place. And it takes place in a fictional world, supposedly, land across the sea, because remember, exploration of the Americas is going on at this time. And it was this perfect idealized society, which meant that it was an improvement upon Henry's society. And Henry, again, didn't respond negatively to that, but down the road, More also started getting into some of the critiques of the Church of England, and Henry in particular in his role, and as such, More ended up getting killed as well. Um, so let's talk about Hans Holbein. Looking there on page 660, we see a level of elevation of Renaissance art, of depth, of texture, the use of shadow and contrast. Portraiture, of course, was huge at this time. And Holbein was probably, he has to be regarded as one of the greatest portrait painters of the era. As evinced by the fact that he did have Holbein go out and paint portraits of women and made his judgment based on those portraits, which ironically backfired horribly on him, as Anne of Cleves was not accurately represented in the portraits. The use of the background and the symbolism of the various background items is also a mark of what Holbein would do. We see there Nicholas Kreutzer, right? The compasses, the wood cutting knife, etc. So not making somebody something that they're not over, nothing over elaborate, but trying to capture the true essence of the person, as opposed to some of the other Renaissance works that we've seen that are designed to make people look very extravagant and courtly. Okay, we don't see that with Holbein. Okay, so we look at Henry's marriages, and specifically not just his marriages, but the results of his marriages. So, from Catherine of Aragon delivered 2 children, only one of which survived. She had numerous miscarriages. The only one to survive was a daughter, Mary. Okay. So at that point, he fell in love with Anne Boleyn. Couldn't marry Anne without the Pope. So married Anne. And Anne turned around then and had a child as well. We have from Anne. Anne had the boy Edward. Okay. And then we have after that Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was Catherine Parr's. I'm sorry, not Catherine Parr. Jane Seymour's child. Okay. Sorry, I can't believe I'm struggling with this. So Edward became king when he was 10 years old. He was, of course, a Protestant, a member of the Church of England. But he died at only 16 years old. And Mary then takes the throne, okay? And Mary, of course, is Catherine of Aragon's daughter, all right? Now, Catherine of Aragon was a devout Catholic, and she had a profound influence on Mary. And Mary attempted to undo the entire Anglican Church that Henry had created. And this, of course, she burned people at the stake. She attempted to tear down everything that her father had created. But her reign actually lasted a shorter period of time than that of her brother. She passed after only 5 years. And so we go from a 6-year reign of Edward to a 5-year reign of Mary, and that brings us to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth turns into one of the greatest rulers England has ever seen. Elizabeth's sister, Mary, became known as Bloody Mary for the things that she did. So you know the game Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. That's actually a play on her horrible nickname because she was a horrible, violent woman. Um, so Elizabeth never married, never had children. She was referred to as the Virgin Queen, although she was not a virgin. She still had sex. Um, she had favorites, but it was all very behind the scenes. People knew about it. There was open secrets when she was sleeping with somebody, but she never allied with anybody because she knew she was walking this fine line in a divided England between Catholic and Protestant. She herself was a Protestant. Okay, she took back on the mantle of head of the Church of England, and ran the church. Okay, now there were other forms of Protestantism within the church, or there were other forms of Protestantism in England that Mary constantly had to fight with. For example, the Congregationalists didn't acknowledge any superiority over individual congregations. Individual congregations, they felt, had the right to make their own rules. The Presbyterians wanted to replace bishops with a group of presbyters or elders that would make decisions on the part of the church. And she tried to give them as much freedom as possible, but they became more and more vocal and outspoken against her and actively working against the throne until finally in 1593 she had to act and against the Congregationalists, and they could either submit or they could be killed. Groups, that's actually how we end up with some of the people fleeing England to the Americas. The Catholics were another story altogether. There were those who felt that her cousin, ironically named Mary, Mary was Catholic and she was Scottish, Mary Queen of Scots. And many people in England wanted to see Mary ascend to the throne of all England. Obviously, there were a couple issues with that. Many didn't. Elizabeth already had the throne, and there were several who felt that they didn't want a Scot ruling England. And again, Elizabeth attempted as much as possible to be tolerant and to try to work things out with her cousin Mary. It didn't work. And Mary attempted to have Elizabeth assassinated. And at that point, Elizabeth had to act and had her killed. At this point, Spain, because Spain moved against moved against Elizabeth at that point, because they felt that the true Catholic ruler of England had just been killed. And they gathered together the Armada, which at that point was probably the greatest naval force the world had ever seen. And this battle, changed the fate of the world. There are a few turning points in history to where you can point directly at a moment and say everything changed here. And it was this moment when these 25,000 soldiers on 130 ships came after England, and they were going to pick up 17,000 more men from Flanders. It was going to be an overwhelming force, and it would have been one that would have been almost impossible for England to resist. And the English sent out 6 small ships in the middle of the night, loaded with explosives, set them off, and destroyed many ships. The next morning, the remaining ships found themselves against the English fleet, which had snuck up on them in the night while they were dealing with the remnants of what had happened from the explosions. 18 more ships were lost. The Armada then ended up being pursued by the English. The Spanish ships were bigger. They were stronger. The English ships were faster and could sail circles around them. And so while these big lumbering ships with massive cannons were trying to turn to get their bearings on these smaller ships, the English ships were sailing around and going bang, 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 bang. And finally, as the Spanish fled, they hit storms. And these storms were absolutely devastated what was left of the fleet. Only 60 of the 130 Spanish ships survived, and countless thousands of lives were lost. And this shifted the balance of power in the world, and the Spanish never recovered. Okay, they were still significant, but that's the moment. That's the moment when England became the most powerful force in the world. Okay, or started ascending to it. Like I said, the Spain would never recover. The smaller, more mobile English ships would go out around the world, establishing English colonies. Spanish ships, the bigger, slower, could not keep up, and they did. The love of big as opposed to effective would ultimately be Spain's undoing on their ships. England really came to see itself after this moment and under Elizabethan rule as a shining example to the rest of the world of culture. At that point, few could outdo the English for snootiness. So a big part of this came from the fact that during the Acts of Dissolution, when Henry broke up the church, okay, when Henry broke up the Catholic Church in England, he seized all of the church's property, including land, and he started selling it off. Okay, so if you wanted land, Henry had it for you. All the wealth of the church that went straight into England's coffers. Okay, England became rich overnight by taking all the money from the Catholic Church. They became rich from turning around and selling the lands. And now all of a sudden you have this newly landed nobility that has the desire to build wealth. And they did it because now, especially with Spain being out of the picture, they could start trading. And they did so very, very effectively. Shakespeare himself, his father, bought land. And Shakespeare, therefore, was a landed gentleman. So this really shifted everything. While we do see how talented Holbein was, there really wasn't anyone to match him, especially in England. A lot of the art comes across very flat at this time. But it is very elaborate. There was an emphasis on these beautiful, intricate little patterns, especially in dress, and then capturing that was kind of unique to English art at this time. So, yes, there was definitely a lack of sophistication of texture and shadow, but a love of pattern that we see. The other thing we see at this time is the rise of the sonnet. The sonnet becomes probably the most popular poetic form in England. The Italian or Petrarchian sonnet, and then the Shakespearean sonnet, which should be called the Howard sonnet, because, damn it, we made it. Let's see here. I'm not going to get too much into the music of the time. Of course, there was a movement into English songs away from the Catholic Mass, as opposed to the Latin that we saw in Catholicism. We have anthems, the full anthem with the chorus throughout, or sung by the chorus throughout, and the first anthem, which alternates solos with instrumental accompaniment. Um, but really, probably one of the biggest things we see is the rise of drama, and it's a rise of drama in a way that I can't think of anything comparable to it in the Western world, as far as the emphasis on drama since really Greece. Okay, um, so we have early on we have two different kinds of plays. This is pre-Elizabethan, right? We have the miracle play and the morality play. And the miracle plays take biblical events and they show them on stage. Um, these are done in cycles. So, and what towns would do is there would be a certain events that were shown. For example, there would be a play about creation. It actually started before that. There would be a play about the fall of Lucifer, right? There would be a play about the creation. There would be a play about the fall of Adam and Eve. There are certain biblical events that were shown in each one of these plays, and what would happen is a town would put on all of these plays. Okay, so we have the Chester, York, Townley, and Coventry plays, right? And what would happen is, remember we've talked about guilds. So like every year, for example, the Butchers Guild would do Noah, right? And then the Bakers Guild would do the fall of Lucifer, and they'd make wagons, okay? And on these wagons, they would construct trap doors, etc., to show a fall. And each one of these wagons were owned by one of the guilds, and the guild would put on the play every year. And so you could go through the town from wagon to wagon to wagon. When I say wagon, think of like a float in a parade, right? And they go around, and you could see all the different plays in the town when they would put these on every year. And towns would compete with each other to have the biggest, best spectacle with these. Okay, so Henry, of course, was very big into plays. I'm sorry, I talked about the miracle plays. Morality plays are plays that would tell a story to try to teach some type of moral lesson. For example, there's the play Everyman, right? And Everyman is going through his life, and he has different virtues telling him how to live his life. And of course, there's temptation from various of the 7 sins, right? Trying to tempt him to do things poor. So these aren't from the Bible, but they're still designed to teach lessons. So Henry VIII liked revels. So these are these big, over-the-top entertainments that would weren't moralistic at all. And so he'd bring in plays and productions that were more secular. Okay, and there was a master of revels. And the master of revels basically signed off on what could and could not be shown and under what conditions. It was the master of revels was basically a regulatory body. Okay, so they also had, like, during intermission of the interludes, or like an intermission, there would be people who would come in and they do perform music. So probably the biggest thing to know about here is how cheap it was to get into plays. One of the things, it only cost a penny. Okay, it only cost a penny to go into plays, and people could make 3 or 4 pennies a day. So going to see a play on the weekend wasn't that bad. Entertainment was affordable, and it was across the river, and so you'd have people going across the bridges. You'd have there was a whole industry of watermen, which were basically people who would take people on boats from one side of the river to the other to come see the plays. This was most of the people were what were called groundlings, and the groundlings, they paid their penny, And you'd have the stage, if you look there on 670, and then you'd have this flat area on the bottom around the stage where people would just stand, okay? Standing room only, right? And then along the sides, you had the boxes, okay? And that's where people who could afford to sit on a cushion would be. And those cost more, obviously. So you would talk about basically about 9,000 people coming to see plays on a regular basis, right, on a daily basis. Women were not allowed to be actors, which meant that the parts of women were played by young boys whose voice hadn't changed yet. Shakespeare really didn't play major roles in his plays himself. He usually played the smaller roles. That was just what he preferred. There was no lighting, so plays had to be performed during the day. Props were pretty minimal, right? A chair, something like that. Too difficult to try to do anything at the time. So you would have some sets, some elaborate sets, but overall it was pretty basic most of the time. Excuse me. We talk about Shakespeare a lot, but I do want to talk about one other person, and that is Philip Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was one of the men that died too early. He wrote several plays, probably the greatest of which is The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. He was probably a spy as well. The crown basically turned on him, the queen. He was fleeing from her when he supposedly got into a bar fight over a tab and was stabbed in the eye while fleeing from the queen. He was probably assassinated. The story doesn't add up. Had Marlowe lived, we wouldn't be calling it the era of Shakespeare. We'd be calling it the era of Shakespeare and Marlowe, because he had every bit as much talent as Shakespeare. He just didn't have the time to develop it, dying as young as he did. This tale of Dr. Faustus is about a man who sold his soul to the devil for power, for wealth, for beauty, for money, basically everything that he wanted, for 24 years. And at the end, he gets to the end and he realizes, oh my God, I had 24 years and now I'm going to be tormented forever. And he has this... Faust just has these incredible speeches. The development of character for Faust is fantastic. I really enjoy Marlowe and his approach to developing this play. It's one of my favorites. Okay, so let's talk about Shakespeare, because we can't talk about this era without talking about Bill the Bard, right? So he was probably originally his plays were originally performed in the Rose Theater. Shakespeare's basically, for all practical purposes, abandoned his wife, Anne Hathaway, not that Anne Hathaway, to come to England and write. His company was by Burbage, was the head of the company, and it was called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, because the Lord Chamberlain was the sponsor of the troupe. Okay, he's the one. The Lord Chamberlain is the one which is a public office. The Chamberlain was a public office by royalty, and so he earned 10% of the gate, and he often wrote his plays with a specific actor in mind to portray them. So Burbage played most of them. Richard II, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear. A lot of his characters have short songs throughout the plays, but none of Burbage's, because Burbage couldn't sing. It's kind of a funny little footnote. Um, Shakespeare was acknowledged as the master of the medium, although there is people now believe that Marlowe, he at least collaborated on a play, at least one play with Marlowe. Um, Hamlet, many people consider to be his greatest work. I don't. Um, I find it dreary and not just depressing, but I have little sympathy for Hamlet. I think one of the things that you always have to have for a character is you have to have some type of emotional attachment to them, and I personally find Hamlet very hard to relate to. But it is an example of a wonderfully wrought play. Okay, a wonderfully wrought play. It's created well, and it is a revenge play. Hamlet's uncle murdered his father and married his mother. His mother was aware of the plot, knows what happened, and so Hamlet is debating whether or not to take revenge upon his uncle and mother. So this is the basis of a revenge play. All right. Now, The Tempest. Let's talk about The Tempest. The Tempest is one of Shakespeare's last works. Many believe it to be his second to last work. And personally, I much prefer The Tempest. It is an amazing work. It's Prospero, a magician, and his daughter are on an island. They have taken this island over. It is where he works his magic. And there was a witch previously upon the island, now deceased. Her son, Caliban, is now the basically servant of Prospero. And Prospero has supposedly civilized Caliban. But Caliban is not happy with his being civilized. He says, "You've taught me to speak, but my only benefit on it is that I can now curse you." And Shakespeare wrote this during the time of exploration of the New World of the Americas. And many people look at Caliban now as a symbol of the way that indigenous people were treated by those who took over their lands. Caliban is, basically having to be in servitude to Prospero because Prospero has magic, and if he doesn't, he'll be punished. And this is how indigenous people were treated. Now, Shakespeare was not overly sympathetic to his own character. Prospero was written in a lot of ways as a brute. He threatens to rape Prospero's daughter. But more and more portrayals of Caliban have been sympathetic in the theater. And I highly recommend watching this one if you can find. There's actually a wonderful version of it with, I believe it's Judi Dench as the magician Prospero. So they gender swapped it. Okay, Roanoke, the Roanoke colonies. Sir Walter Raleigh often established this colony of Roanoke, which basically means money in the native language, and put about 108 men there in 1585. They were soldiers, and the colony vanished. I mean, it just vanished. Um, there were. It's one of the great mysteries as to what exactly happened to the colonists at Roanoke. Um, Later, of course, we have Jamestown. Okay. Um, Jamestown, with the colonists there, about 100 colonists. They had been promised 500 acres apiece. Um, and it did not do well. They were supposed to get provisions for the colony, which ended up being held up. So, I'm sorry, it's diving into the Roanoke mystery. So yeah, the colony was supposed to be reprovisioned. The Roanoke colony was supposed to be reprovisioned. The reprovisions were delayed, and when they got there, everyone was basically gone. John Smith in 1607 established a colony in Virginia. This is the colony of Jamestown. This is also where we get the legend of Pocahontas from. Disney has done so much disservice to the reality of that. Pocahontas, whether or not she actually did intervene with her father Powhatan to save Captain Smith's life, we don't know exactly. It's apocryphal. But here's what we do know. She ended up being captured as a girl between 10 and 12 years old. She was a hostage. She was then married off as a child bride to one of the colonists, John Rolfe. Had a child in 1615. The fact that she was married to him and had a child kind of soothed relationships between the colonists and the natives, which had grown very tenuous. However, she was basically sold off as a child bride and raped. And then she had her heritage stripped from her. She was forced to adopt white ways. They then traveled to England. She was not received at court, but they did go to a masked ball given by King James and Queen Anne. And she ended up dying in England, and was buried in England rather than in her home soil. So, this whole idea of Pocahontas and some wonderful romantic relationship is about as far from the truth as you can get. It's one thing to mess with fairy tales, right? To tell Cinderella very differently, or to tell the story of Aladdin very differently. Those are already mythical stories. But to take a real person and their real suffering and to turn it into some type of fairy tale, romance, magic, when in actuality what you have is a young girl who was kidnapped and raped, is not okay. All right. We have one more chapter. Chapter 20. Please make sure that you are keeping up on your discussion boards, and I will talk to you guys soon.